Okay, we're now moving on to perhaps the most important principle of asset management, which is called alignment. Let me take you through what that means. If asset management is about the optimal life cycle management of physical assets to sustainably achieve the stated business objectives, how do we actually do this? How do we make sure that the things we actually do to the assets will deliver what the organisation requires? And remember that this has to be hitting all the targets on cost, risk, and asset performance. How do we actually do that? Well, the way we do that is we have to, first of all, intend to do it. We have to think, we have to orient ourselves, all our decisions, towards what is it actually going to deliver for the organisation. So here's the problem. We have our organisational objectives and strategy, what we want to achieve to deliver the customers at a certain rate, certain risk level, compliant with all the laws. So we have our targets and our goals that we want to deliver. And our challenge as asset people is how to make sure that everything we do on the ground to the assets, that's our delivery, actually is going to deliver these top level objectives. And remember, the problem is that we have thousands of decisions and thousands of different things we do to the assets every day. So it's not a simple matter of coordination. I have once or twice taught people with very, very tiny systems. So I've taught people who basically have 5 assets. They've got one river intake, they've got one big pipe to a water treatment works, and then one other big pipe that takes treated water to a town. And they, on the whole, people who have that many assets are quite happy people, because as an asset manager, if you only have 5 or 10 assets, you can know all your assets, you know how they all fit together, you know everybody who's working on them. And that makes it quite easy to coordinate and think of the whole thing as a system. But Tacoma Power doesn't have 5 assets, it has 50,000 assets. So this is obviously a problem just about sheer scale. And the more assets you have and the more people you have working on them, the more complicated this is to do. So our problem is how to make sure that everything at the bottom on delivery is actually going to deliver our corporate goals. The original answer came with the very definition of asset management. Right from the beginning is the idea that we have a coordinated plan. You can see how this works. If we have a coordinated plan for the next 5 to 10 years, where we pull together in one place all the things we're going to do on our assets, we have a chance to actually see what they all add up to. If we have 55 different plans, totally discoordinated, with different departments responsible for them, then there's really no chance that we know what it all adds up to. So it's obviously a good step to have an integrated plan where we can look across all our assets and all the actions we're going to do the next 5 to 10 years and say, okay, we can see what this adds up to. The problem is, if you're something like Tacoma Power, it's still quite complicated to do that integrated plan because you have thousands of assets and thousands of things you do to those assets. So the first people who really tried to do this planning, and that's really Australia and New Zealand, in power, water, rail, discovered that we need some more steps, some more translation steps. We can't go straight from our goals to a good plan because we've got to decide what it is we need to do to put into the plan in the first place. So what came out of New Zealand and people with lots of experience of planning was these other steps. And the first step was called the asset management policy. Now, policy is really a short statement of our principles, how we want to manage our assets. And we'll have a look at Tacoma Power's asset management policy in a minute. But it's basically, what does it mean to manage our assets well? And the kind of thing we're talking about are principles about considering all the costs across the life cycle when you make a decision, making sure that you make decisions which take into account risk, that use good evidence and data. These are all good principles of asset management. So that's very useful. It sort of says, if this is what we want to do as an organisation, here are some of the principles that we actually want to use to know that we're actually managing our assets well. But it's just a page, it's just high-level principles. The next bit is perhaps where the real meat of the problem comes in, when we start to develop our strategies for our assets and to go along with strategies, what it is we want those assets to achieve. Now, I said earlier on that we shouldn't be frightened of the word strategy. It just means getting the right people in a room to think ahead. How do we want to manage distribution transformers? How do we want to manage towers? What do we know about our assets, and what do we think is a good way of managing them? Is it to continue doing what we're doing, or is there room for improvement? So asset strategies are really thinking ahead of how we think we should manage a distribution transformer or a tower. Now, it's very obvious, even to people who don't know much about power, that a transformer and a tower probably don't have the same strategy. We manage them in different ways. And that's going to be true for all our assets. What's perhaps not quite so obvious here is the idea that every strategy we have also has a target. And not just any target, but a SMART target. So, what is a SMART target? I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but a SMART target is basically one that it's very specific what it's actually going to achieve. So, SMART. It's an acronym and it stands for specific, measurable, excuse the wonky writing, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic or reasonable, and time-based. So what's so important about SMART targets? The phrase doesn't come from asset management, it comes from more generally from business, but it's the idea that if we do something, we should definitely know what it is we're trying to achieve, and not in a general way, but a very specific way. If we put in place this maintenance strategy for this distribution transformer, we are aiming to get this amount of reliability out of it. Now, this is a very important principle because it kind of makes sense here. The corporate goals themselves need to be smart, not just hand-waving about safe and customer-friendly, but actually saying specifically how safe, exactly what level of reliability are we delivering to the customers, how compliant are we going to be. We'll come back to this issue in a minute. The idea is if it's clear what we've got to achieve at the top, we've also got to be clear what we've got to achieve from any given group of assets or even an individual asset. When we do a strategy, we don't just go, this is a good thing to do. We say, we need to do this strategy because we want to deliver this SAIDI figure or this unplanned outages reduction, whatever it might be. So SMART targets. Now we'll come back to each of the components here because they're all important. But the principle here I want to get across is that we have to translate down from our organizational goals through how we're going to manage our assets and how that specifically means we want to approach maintenance or replacement or new technology. And when we've got those strategies that say this is how we want to manage our assets, then we put those together in an integrated plan. And then that integrated plan then drives what we actually do to the assets on the ground. This is a very important principle, and it's quite important to spot that we don't do it at the moment. Most people actually don't have that middle bit of explicit strategies. And even if they do, they aren't smart. I don't mean they're not clever. I mean, they're not specific about what they've actually got to deliver. One of the problems here is that we have plenty of strategies already. We just don't call them strategies. We call them standards. And we have probably 10, 100,000 standards to apply to us in electricity. The problem is, do all those standards add up? And we can't know that they all add up to the right answer. We don't even ask the question what it is they're actually delivering. So this is really an overriding principle in asset management, is that we have to be aligned. And I'll warn you right now, it's actually a lot harder to do than it might sound. We'll come back to how we might do that in practice, but it's important to have a sense of these different blocks. The asset management policy with its principles of what it means to manage assets well, our strategies that say how we want to approach our different asset classes and systems, and then our integrated plan. So let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. First, I want to jump out, if this is a kind of spine of asset management, I want to jump out to just show you ISO 55000. You remember ISO 55000 is the international standard on asset management. And you'll see this backbone appears right in the middle of the ISO 55000 document. Of course, I forgot something, which is, before I do that, that another important principle, which I hope people in the front line will appreciate, is there's no good them telling us at the top what they want us to achieve if they don't understand the reality of the assets on the ground. There has to be two-way communication. Feedback. Okay, this is what we intended to do. Remember the plan, do, check, act. There's more than that. What's the reality of the assets on the ground? If the assets are all worn out and it's going to take a lot of money to sort them out, there's no good the organisation just hoping it can cut costs and still deliver. So the reality of the assets must be fed up. At the same time, the goals of the organisation kind of come down. All right, so here is ISO 55000, and I have not erased because I'm, there we are. Okay, so this is ISO 55000, a diagram that spells out the key elements of this standard. But I hope you'll notice straight away that we've got this backbone, and it goes from our organisational goals and objectives, our asset management strategy and objectives, and our asset management planning. The planning then drives the actual going out to do the work, the delivery on the assets themselves, and then of course that feedback loop that says what happened next. You'll notice on the right-hand side there are supporting plans and strategies, for example, how to get the right information we need, or how to make sure people have the right skills. Those are supporting strategies. The important thing is this alignment or line of sight. Okay, and now I've learned how to make sure that I take that off again. Just so that you can see, here is, no, I'll get there in a minute. Oops, there we are. This is ISO 55000 in detail, the section called 55001. I'm not going to go through this, but you'll see against each of these the things we need in place. So you'll notice, for example, it says you have to have the right people with the right skills, with the right communications, you have to have the right information, as well as your policy, your strategy, and your planning and management of change, which could be making sure that we know when we change an asset out, put in a new asset, that we record it and we understand we've now got a new asset. So here's just an overview of ISO 55000. Just to hopefully make this a little bit more concrete, here's an example, a worked example. So we start with the goal at the top. We have a target to improve availability, or for example, improve our SAIDI, SAFI, etc. figures, or unplanned outages. So we have a target that we want to improve the availability and reliability of our assets. Now, if we want to do that, a good principle is that we're going to think about reliability. How can we improve the reliability of our assets through better decisions? You'll notice it's just a principle. It doesn't say anything about money or how we're going to do it. It just says we're going to think about reliability when we decide what we're going to do with assets. That probably sounds obvious to you. Now, if that's the principle we're going to use to approach our decisions, what does it mean in strategy terms? Strategy is where we start to build up how we're actually going to do this. So one element of reliability that we could decide to do is to look at reliability in maintenance, do something called risk-based maintenance, and that we need to think about how and where we're going to apply it. We're going to apply risk-based maintenance to our most critical assets. In other words, the assets where if they fail, they maybe affect the most people, the most households. Okay, so that's a strategy, the beginning of strategy. Now we do more work on strategies because we have to say which are the most critical assets, how do we want to apply risk-based maintenance. Okay, there's more strategizing to go. But what I want to draw your attention to is, at the end of this, what are we committing? If we do all this wonderful risk-based maintenance, what are we actually going to deliver for the organisation? We're going to deliver, if we do risk-based maintenance, we're committing to deliver an improvement in reliability, a decrease in failure rate of engines of 20%, for no net increase in cost by September 2021. You see what I mean by a smart target? If we do this strategy, we will deliver this in terms of risk, cost, and performance by a certain time. Specific, measurable, achievable, reasonable or realistic, and time-based or time-bound. You might ask, how do we know that we're going to get 20% improvement in reliability of our engines? Well, we can only know that if we've looked at the data, we've done the analysis, we've done the modelling, maybe we've done a pilot study, maybe we've looked at our neighbours of what they've achieved. We don't just pluck a figure out of thin air. We do the homework to say, if we do this, we are confident we can improve reliability. And indeed, it's true for many assets. Of thorough risk reliability-based maintenance would improve the reliability of our assets. Okay, now we have our strategy and our asset management objectives. We're now going to start planning. And this is easy. A plan is a plan. It has a start date, end date, money, resources, milestones, everything you'd expect in something like a project plan. It's a plan. It's got dates, it's got money, it's got people. This is how we're actually going to do it in practice day to day. So hopefully that gives you a little sense of the difference between policy, strategy, and planning. I will apologise immediately that in the rest of life, these words can be used interchangeably, and so it's quite confusing. In asset management, they use very specifically, and they're very important. And even if you don't use exactly these terms, that idea of principles that we use, strategies where we think through how we're going to manage a class of assets, and then planning when you bring it all together to say, okay, this is what we're going to do next year, the year after that. Okay, so that's alignment. Now, just go back a minute. This presupposes we know what the organisational objectives are, and this actually can be where it starts to go wrong. So I would like you just to think briefly, what are the key goals and targets for Tacoma Power at the moment? Now, I'm sorry that you're at home and not in a meeting room, because you'd probably have a nice poster up in a meeting room that would tell you what some of the high-level goals are for Tacoma Power. Some of them aren't very smart, and remember, smart doesn't mean clever here. They may just say that we want to work safely and we want to deliver customer satisfaction and we want to be compliant. What we really want is these to be more specific. Exactly what do we want to deliver to customers? Exactly how reliable do we want our assets to be? Remember, in the world of optimizing, doing more than you need is no better really than doing less. Because if you do more than you need, you'll spend more money than you have. So if you have to think about Tacoma Power, what do you know about what the key targets are? And the next questions in asset management then are, which of these are a challenge? Is the challenge money? Is the challenge reliability? Now, for many people in infrastructure in the US, it's not really reliability that's the problem. It's often money that's the issue. We're spending more money than the customers actually want to pay. So once we know what the challenge is, something that we're going to have to work hard to meet, we then can actually ask what we're going to do about them. And we also have to pay attention to the ones where they might conflict. Yes, we could save money, but not if that's at the expense of reliability. Remember, asset management doesn't just go save money at all costs. It goes, no, we have to balance at every point cost, risk, and performance. Let's have a look at, I'm not going to pull up a list of Tacoma Power goals, but leave it with a question. Is it obvious what the goals are? Is it obvious what the targets are? And do we know how well we're doing against them? But here's just some typical categories of organisational targets. The first one I have is growth. Where is it that we are targeting to deliver new services, new capabilities, extend our geographical coverage, take over another organisation? All these things are growth. In other words, things on top of what we do at the moment. And the examples I use are electric vehicle charging points, which is, of course, a service we didn't provide before, and things like battery storage on transmission that is starting to become quite important. But again, is a new kind of capability that we're putting in place. So those are growth. Now I start with them because usually it's pretty clear. Somebody says in the next year we want to put in so many EV charging points. And so we all know what we have to get on and do. And those of us working with putting in those electric vehicle charging points kind of know what we're aiming for. So far, so good. A second category of organisational goals we always have will relate to dollars. Sometimes we're going to be very worried about income, but we always are worried about expenditure because we have to spend money to get what we need out of our assets. And just in case you were thinking you didn't have a target, everybody has targets on expenditure because everybody has budgets. All teams have budgets. And essentially, it's more or less terrible if you don't meet your budgets. I mean, it could be terrible in which you just run out of money and you can't do things, or you get a lot of tutting from senior management and told not to do it again. But everybody has budgets. Sometimes on top of budgets, you've got cost reduction targets. We want to save 5% of our operating costs next year. Another absolutely key set of goals, which hopefully now starts to look more familiar, is availability. Essentially for power, it's always going to be availability, which is the opposite of outages. This is for distribution world, is the world of SAIDI, SAFE, etc. And these are quite interesting because these are all different ways of measuring outages. I imagine at some point somebody said, outages are a bad idea, so let's minimize the number of outages we have next year. The problem with this is it isn't actually that smart, because what would be one way to minimize the number of outages you have? Well, as one cynic said, just have one long outage. Would only count as one. You see what I'm talking about? No, we didn't mean number of outages. We also wanted to take into account how long they were and how many people they affected, and then how many people get affected more than once. And then we start to get the family of these outage figures that, of course, are federally defined. So we have to report on them. Even if we didn't want to, we've got targets on those. So for electricity, availability is really the biggest performance category of measures that we're going to have to meet. If the assets aren't working when we need them, that means some people are going to go without electricity. Of course, that can be sometimes not that direct, but in the end, availability is what we're all looking for. Now, just an aside, obviously in transmission, we quite often put in redundancy so that if one asset fails, that doesn't lead to an outage. However, as the assets start getting older, the risk that two assets will fail together goes up. And then we could really be worried about availability. It's what, at the end of the day, we're always looking for. Now, there'll be other goals, again, probably ones you're very familiar with, around safety. The safety can be public safety, of course, could be cyber security and worker safety. And normally people have a pretty good idea of what kind of things we measure for worker safety. It's a good example of fairly smart targets, smart as in well-defined. For example, lost time injuries or reportable accidents. Those are all defined, again, usually even federally, that we set a target to say that we'll have usually a reducing number of incidents or accidents. Going for zero is in one fell swoop is very difficult to do. So usually people have just reduce it year on year. We'll also have some environmental targets. Those could be legal from the state, or they could be internal from the executive. around things like carbon dioxide emissions and other things. So we've probably got quite a few targets on environment. And then there'll be other compliance. I mean, I'm not going to go into other compliance. There's all kinds of laws that Tacoma Power has to apply, has to follow, not running off with the public funds or all kinds of things. So other compliance. It's also very usual to have customer satisfaction measures, which of course are very related to availability. If the power goes out a lot, you don't expect to have happy customers. So they're related to each other. Usually this is done through customer surveys. And usually the target is, let's have slightly happier customers this year than we did last year. We all know that this year is going to give us some interesting challenges, and probably some of these targets are going to be quite difficult to meet. Now, the last one I put down is something that's important, but probably isn't an explicit target. And that's an interesting problem. We know that our organisation cares about its reputation with its customers and its regulators and the politicians. But do we have a target on it? Probably not. Nevertheless, we may need still to bear it in mind when we make decisions. Okay, so that is organisational goals. And the whole point is, if we know what it is we're expected to deliver, the rest of us can get together and decide how we're going to deliver it. So this is how it really works. I said right at the beginning that asset management is about decision making, but obviously sometimes those decisions are not made by us. They're made by the executive or even higher, the city, for example. So how, as asset people, are we involved with decision making? And it works a little bit like this. When I spend quite a lot of time talking to executives about asset management, and I say, this is the deal. If you're clear about the goals and targets you want the organisation to deliver, then our job as asset people is to work out, what are your options? What are the implications? If we do this, what will it cost? If we do that, what will it cost? We're not making the decisions. Our job is to put in front of the executive options that they can choose between to meet what they want to achieve. Now, both parts of this can not work. Top management may not be very clear on what they want, in which case it's quite difficult for us to work out how to do it. And we may not be very clear about what the options are and the implications and what the evidence is. But our job, and this is really a big job of asset management, is to make it clear. Yes, Mr. CEO or Ms. General Manager, you can make whichever decision you like, but this is what happens if you make this decision. This is what happens if you don't make it. And the whole point of an asset manager is you try to be, you don't sort of stamp your feet and say they must decide. That doesn't work very well anyway. We want to say, on the one hand, this is what you get if you do this. This is what will happen if you don't do it or if you do something else. Those implications of cost and risk. And that's very much a big part of what asset management's all about, getting the evidence and showing, if we do this, what happens. If you do that, what happens. Now, if they're clear about what they want and we come back with them with good options and the implications of the decisions are made clear, then they can make better decisions and then we can cheerfully go off and implement them. That's kind of the deal with top management. Top management's a technical term, by the way. The people who make the decisions about the strategy at the business level. Okay, so that's our relationship with top management. I want now to talk a little bit about, we're going to have a look at a little case study. But in order to see what's going on in the case study, I want to talk briefly about something around capability. How do you know how good you are at asset management? Especially given that asset management is quite a new area, how does an organisation measure itself on how good it is at it? This is quite a tricky question, and the way that we normally do it around the world is that essentially you are assessed against a set of agreed topics. You'll notice, I hope, here that we've got 6 boxes, all nicely colour-coded. The 6 boxes are the original 6-box model, if you remember, strategy and planning, decision-making, etc. And there's a global consensus that under each of those, there's some subheadings of things that you need if you're going to manage your assets well. This is a list of 39 subjects, which is a joke in England, which doesn't carry across to Washington State, I suspect. 39 subjects, and essentially we benchmark against how good are we at each of these compared to other people in power, other people in other sectors, other people in other countries. So this is the primary tool for working out how good are we. You're probably better than you think you are, but probably not as good as your top management think you are. It's a general way. So essentially assessment goes through all of these, and then out of it you get a scale, which I love this scale. Don't pay too much attention to percentages because that's just a scoring system. But you'll notice there are phases. My favourite phase is innocent, means I don't have a clue. I don't even know that asset management exists. Then the next phase is aware, which is, well, I know there's such a thing, but we're not actually doing it. Developing, right, we're starting to put in place the right things. Competent, now this sounds a slightly rude word, but it means I've kind of got the bits in place, but they're not yet coming through with really good decisions every time. Because that's the realm of effective or optimal, where basically we're now getting to the point where every decision we make is based on the right evidence, is thinking about risk, is really taking into account cost and performance as well. Nobody in the world actually really aspires or realistically aspires to be the best in the world, to be that 100%, not least because what's best practice keeps moving to the right. So you could ask, where are most people in the world? Well, I'm afraid the answer is most people are innocent, and a smaller group are aware. And usually once people are aware and understand what they're not doing, they start moving and developing. I think we'll find that a lot of utilities in the USA will be in developing. They're putting things in place, things are definitely improving, but they haven't got it all, it doesn't all quite yet add up to this framework. You'll notice, I hope, that compliance with ISO 55001, that's this bit here, is only at the end of competent. It's not optimal. It's not yet the same thing as being sure that all your decisions are actually good. So even if you go for ISO 55000 as your framework, you've still got to build on that. And in practice, not many US companies have got as far as ISO 55000, but even in other countries like Australia, where they've been doing it for quite a lot longer, I'd say even still, there's still the very best in the world are probably sort of here. It's a very interesting discussion about what it would mean to move beyond that. So that's a kind of scale we can measure ourselves on. So let's have a look at how that actually works. So a typical way of depicting this, now in this particular diagram you have to read it that the center is bad, is innocent, and the pink on the outside is, I don't know what you can call it, it's definitely not a target, as in a target for arrows. We can sometimes call it a radar. So if you read it, the nearer you are to the center, the less mature you are. We're going to have a look at a lightly fictionalized company called Util Corp, which is an electricity distribution company, where you'll notice their line is blue and the sector average is red. And you'll see in that Util Corp is actually less mature than the average in their sector. Quite typically, Util Corp is actually fine when you have a look at this. This is very, very typical that if you are managing to deliver to customers, these kind of processes, your delivery processes, will probably be pretty good. Remember what I said is normally if we go into an organization, we don't find it's delivery that's the issue. The guys on the ground know what they're doing and they get on with it. What's interesting here, you'll see, is that Util Corp is pretty good on actually doing its maintenance, building capital projects, etc. Where it's really weak is on the sort of strategic side of asset management, it's not great on risk, and probably related to this, it isn't great on asset information. And that's very typically, if we go into an organisation that's heard of asset management, it's interested, it wants to get better, those are the areas that would be weakest. Because those are, if you don't know about asset management, they're the bits you probably won't be focusing on. We'll come back later on to where Tacoma Power actually is. Tacoma Power has done an assessment against 39 subjects, and it more or less followed this pattern. Okay, so we now know where we are, and of course that now gives Util Corp the possibility to say, okay, where do we want to go in future? So again, we'll come back to that a little bit, but we're very weak on our strategy in planning. We're not very good on risk, and our information's not that great. So those are probably the areas we want to improve on. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how we might, just a quick sense of how you might know how good you are in asset management. But I want to do something else now, which is to look at this in the context of actual challenges. So I want you to imagine for a minute that you're on the board of Util Corp, and I want you to consider what are the business challenges, not anything to do with asset management to begin with, but what are the business challenges that are facing you, problems that you have to solve. So let's have a look at this. I'm hoping this is going to be readable. Okay, what I'd like to do now is for you to read this summary of where Util Corp is, and you'll find that there are about 5 different challenges that Util Corp has at the moment. They're not all terrible challenges, but they all require that Util Corp does something. So have a quick read of this and maybe make a quick note of what the challenges are that you can see there. I reckon there are about 5 challenges. Okay, so a little bit easier to do on paper, actually, where you can take, or if you know how to use a highlighter, which, as you know, I'm just learning, to actually highlight what those challenges are. So we've got a few challenges, some of them pretty typical. All right, so let's work our way through this. Oops, yeah. I reckon there are about 5. The first challenge that Util Corp has is that their assets are aging, and we're starting to see a deteriorating trend in reliability. This is worrying the regulator, and it ought to worry the board as well. So we've got a problem of aging assets. As I said, that's a pretty typical problem. The second problem we have, which is also pretty typical, is the regulator has got no mercy and thinks that even though we've got these aging assets and reliability is starting to go south a bit, we have to try and deliver what we're delivering for steadily reducing cost. So we're being squeezed on cost, and that's absolutely common everywhere. We've got a few more interesting challenges. We've got a funny thing happening with demand. There was a recession and industrial demand has gone down, partly because some industries have gone away, maybe replaced with other industries that don't use so much electricity. At the same time, we're bouncing back on household demand and the population is growing. So I don't know, this may be in fact true of Tacoma as a city. A change over time of industrial mix, and of course Tacoma is growing. So we've got a complex demand and load situation that we have to understand. Now the next problem, the fourth one, is an intriguing one. They're developing the old docklands, and as part of this, putting in an electrified train line to the docklands, where although we're not building that train line, we're not train people anyway, or electricity, we have been involved on the electricity side, and the intention is that we take over the electrical assets for completely forgotten what you call it now, but the traction supply for the trains, electrified trains. We're going to manage the electric assets, the substations, the wires, etc. So what kind of things, although this gives us an opportunity, we're always going to sell more electricity, we're also taking on somebody else's system, and that's interesting. And the last one is that the government has asked for everybody to look at resilience. Resilience is an interesting word. How do we deal with, say, with climate change, with more frequent storms or flooding, or in fact droughts? So, interesting question to ask, what kind of resiliency issues does Tacoma face? All right, so we've got about 5 things: aging assets, squeeze on costs from the regulator, mix a complex situation with demand, we're taking over a system that we didn't build. Although that'll give us income, it also will give us some headaches as well, probably. And we have to think about resilience as climate change changes. So now I'm not going to spend too long on this, but let's just pick 1 or 2 of these. So what does this mean for us as asset people? What does it mean if we've got a lot of aging assets? Well, basically, if we've got a lot of aging assets, sooner rather than later, we're going to have to grasp the question of replacing them. And if we have to replace a lot of assets, the real question for an asset manager is the prioritization. Which do we do first? And that's a challenge. We can't do everything at once. We have to have a good process to prioritize which to do first. And the principle here in an asset management policy would be something like risk-based decision-making, risk-based replacements. In other words, we want to think about which assets, if they failed, would give us the biggest problems. These are aging assets, so they're going to start failing sooner rather than later. And we have to think about ranking the order in which we do them by how much risk, how soon, how big the risks they might give us. That gives us a principle in response to this challenge of risk-based replacement. Now, as it happens, risk-based replacement is a really big part of asset management with some very developed techniques. So we're not starting with a blank page here, but notice that risk-based. Not cost-based, not performance-based, but in the end, risk-based. Where are we going to get trouble first and biggest? And that should determine which assets we should replace first. Okay, let's pick another one of my favorites, which is that we're picking up this traction supply system from the new electrified rail system being put in to new development at the Docklands. What kind of thing would that worry you as an asset person? Well, I'm hoping that you've all been involved enough that it's bad enough when you take over assets from one of your colleagues from a capital project internally. But just now think about the issues you might have if you were taking over a system being built by somebody else completely, a different organization that's not thinking the way that you're thinking about electricity. So what kind of principle would we apply here? Well, I'll tell you what, I think there's a practical thing we do here, which is if I'm taking over somebody else's assets, I better go out and survey them, work out what I'm actually being given. This is a bit of the problem of as-builts, but it's also the what am I actually getting? What actual assets? How are they designed? Because one of the challenges still in asset world that shouldn't be there is operations and maintenance having to pick up assets where they don't know what they've got when they're being asked to operate and maintain them. Okay, so you get the idea here that coming from the business challenges, we can start to talk then about what are the principles and then the strategies we want to apply to meet these challenges. Okay, so I said that I would talk a little bit more about Tacoma Power specifically, and we'll talk a little bit as we go through, and then there's a section at the end where somebody else is going to talk about what's actually happening in Tacoma Power at the moment with asset management. But here is the asset management policy. I know it doesn't say policy at the top. That's because another Washington state utility decided that, well, partly because policies for this company, it was for Avista that you might know, a policy is legally binding. So somebody can sue you for not doing a policy. So on the whole, we don't particularly like calling things policies. But much more seriously, they realized that they had the opportunity to say, this isn't just any old policy, it's a commitment. And it's a commitment not from asset managers, but from the executive, a commitment right from the top that this is how we want to manage our assets going forward. This is a particularly good asset management policy, and it has some very nice features about it. Smiling face of superintendent and his signature to say, look, this is my commitment. This isn't you guys have to do things. It's my commitment that this is how Tacoma Power is going to go forward. And you'll see some of the examples here, as well as safety and alignment. We're going to have you start to see some of these principles we've already talked about. So alignment, a systematic framework, like the way ISO 55000 gives you a systematic framework that you can work within. Total cost of ownership, we've talked about that as well, the total costs across the life cycle. Interdependencies, in other words, people are not going to make decisions in isolation, they're going to coordinate them. I hope you can see that all these are good practice principles, and they're now a commitment from the very top that this is how we're going to manage our assets. So hopefully, when you get back into your workplace, we will be distributing paper copies of these as well. So this is a commitment, the asset management policy of Tacoma Power, and it's a good one. I like it very much. Okay, so we now have, remember, we think on our fingers, we've got the corporate objectives at the top with the business challenges. We've got asset management policy that says how we want to manage our assets going forward. We now move one step down to strategy, which is really the biggest part of work that we have to do in asset management. So we've got our policy, and then we start to develop a top-level asset management strategy. I'm not going to say too much about that. That's a summary of why we're doing asset management, what we're going to deliver with asset management, what are the most important things we're going to do. And you'll remember you saw this right at the beginning with alignment. We have this box that says asset management strategy, or strategic asset management plan. But that's a bit oversimple, because between our top level summary of strategy and our planning, asset management plan, there's all sorts of work for the SMEs, the subject matter experts. And we talked a little bit about how we need to have strategies for our groups of assets. Now, these are normally called asset class strategies. How do we want to manage distribution transformers going forward? How do we want to manage transmission towers? Getting the right people around the table to think about how do we manage them at the moment, how do we want to manage them in the future. Not yet a plan, because it's just saying this is what we think is important, this is what we want our approaches to be. A good example here would be a maintenance strategy. So a maintenance strategy for an asset group might be we do manufacturers recommended on this group of assets, or we just do what we've always done. Or maybe we want to be a bit cleverer and we actually want to start optimizing maintenance. So that's an example of a strategy. Okay, so there's quite a lot of work here to keep us all busy. Anybody who's involved in assets, who's knowledgeable about them, will in one way or another need to be involved in this. Where do we want to go going forward? So that's our strategies in practice. Just a little bit to say, so how would you think about going about a strategy? I said already that you could start by saying, what do we do at the moment? And is that good? Is that giving us the results? I just wanted to say a little bit more detail about that. Let's say that we've got a target to reduce outages. Don't know if that's your problem, but it's a typical thing. We're a bit unreliable. We need to be a bit more reliable. We need to cut the outages. So we need to cut them by 50. So how would you go about, as a group of asset knowledgeable people, how would you go about working out what we need to do? Well, the first step is you have to ask why we have outages at the moment. So why do we have 50 more than we want? Where are they happening? So we actually start to say, well, you know, it's whatever it is. I don't know what that would be. The usual suspects. If you've got problems, where do you expect them to be in either distribution or transmission? So which assets and why are we having problems at the moment? So we have a look, and you normally find that if you actually look at outages last year or the last 5 years, some assets, they might be specific assets, or they're more likely to be a particular type of asset, gives us a very high proportion of our problems. And it's not just which assets, but why, the root causes. If you don't understand the root causes, you don't have a good way of thinking about what you should do about them. All right, so we now know that it's a particular class. I mean, when I did this, assets that I knew very well, I don't know if everybody knows, but the biggest problem on trains or buses is doors. Motors can be problematic and the tyres can go flat, but we have a lot of problem with doors on public transport because of those so-and-so passengers who will try to open them, keep them open when we're trying to close them. And we have to design the doors so they don't close so tightly that you catch somebody and drag them along the street or the line. And you don't want them to open too easily because then people fall out. So doors, if you ask people in railways, buses, the usual suspects, it's going to be doors. They're quite a big problem to solve. And then, of course, you must ask why. What is actually going wrong? What's failing on the doors? Because then when you know, well, it's the hydraulics that keep failing, okay, what can we do about that? You're coming up with solution options, and notice the word option in asset management always has an S on it. There's always more than one way to do something. There's always, of course, the option not to do anything at all if it's too expensive or difficult. But what are the options? And then look at each option to say what they cost against what they're actually going to deliver us in reduction in outages. So the cost versus benefit. And then how do we put them together? Now go back to what we wanted to achieve in the first place was what are the combination of things we're going to do that will easily reduce our outages by 50 next year. And any common sense asset manager will know you always want to make sure you've got a bit to spare. You don't try and get exactly 50, but you think, what am I pretty confident if we do this, we're going to save at least 50 outages. Okay, so that is, oops, sorry, she says, let me just go back a minute. So that's how we think about strategies. But basically the idea is you get the right people around the table with a mix of views, operations, maintenance, engineering, finance, whoever, with different experience and different evidence, pull them together to come up with an overall good strategy. Somebody said to me recently in a power company not far from you, that we have bits of strategies, but what the problem we have before we start doing this consciously is we don't pull them all together and see what they all add up to. You're probably getting the theme by now that asset management is always asking, what does it all add up to? This might be a very clever way to manage this particular asset, but where does it fit with everything else? So, okay, so that's strategies. I'd now like to have a quick look at the next step. Remember, organizational objectives at the top, asset management policy, strategies, plural, because we have to, and they have to all work together. Now, if we've got good strategies, we can move to a good plan. I want to talk a little bit about a thing called the asset management plan. The asset management plan isn't a document. It's more like a process. And one thing that we've learned a very hard way is you must have one process. If you have 6 different processes for different teams working out different parts of the plan, that's how you end up with good stupidity stories. You have to have a way to integrate one process for deciding what we're going to do that brings everything together. Best practice will include maintenance. I have to say for many organizations in the US, they're really focusing on the bigger ticket item of investment for refurbishments and replacements. So actually looking at what should we replace first. Do you remember that aging asset issue? So the investment program, and we can also include in that what are we going to get rid of. Sometimes we have assets, they're sometimes called orphan or stranded assets which really aren't doing anything for anybody anymore, to get rid of them. So we have one integrated process that brings all of this together. We have to bring it together because, you know, a dollar is a dollar, and you have to think about people. How many people do we need to do the work? We bring this all together, informed by our strategies, And then that we can then do this as a plan that tells us what the work is we need to do, how many people we need to do it, what it's going to cost us. And notice the words in the middle, it's fully justified. We know why we want to do it. Because in asset management, it's not enough that you do the right thing. You also have to show that it's the right thing. It's justified. The logic makes sense. So that's the idea of the asset management plan, a single integrated process that will plan all the things we need to do to all our assets for the next 5 to 10 years to give us what we need going forward. Okay, so that's planning. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Now, if we're trying to plan everything we're going to do for our assets for the next 10 years, the moment's reflection will tell you that this is going to involve a lot of different people. And I don't just mean engineering and finance. It's going to involve maintenance and operations who understand what the issues are, project managers, business strategy, demand and load forecasting, the people in touch with the customers who know what the customers want, people understanding risk. We need to bring all of this together to come up with our cost risk performance optimized plan. I mean, if you thought it was difficult to do cost risk optimization on one asset, you can see how much more work it's going to be when we have to do it for all our assets together. So those are the inputs, and asset management planning is really coordinating as much as anything, facilitating getting everybody together and a single process that everybody follows. Also, interestingly, is that it's going to give us multiple outputs. Most obvious is it's going to give us a program of capital projects going forward and a maintenance schedule for what maintenance we want to do with our assets for the next 5 to 10 years. Totally entwined with that is what here it says downtime. This is access to the assets, clearances, so that we can, I know that there are clever ways to work on assets when they're live, electrical assets when they're live, which terrify me. But the point is that almost the scarcest resource we have in planning is access to the assets to do any work on them. And instead of this being an afterthought where we decide what we want to do and then we work out how we're going to, out of all of this chaos, coordinate access, I think it should be built into the planning to begin with. Okay, we're going to decide where we're going to take down, and when we've got the assets out, we can decide we should maximize the things we do to those assets while we've actually got access to them. This is a big issue for power. It was a big issue for rail. If you take a rail line out, you are at a stroke just not running any train services on that line, which the passengers don't like very much. So it's very important that it's planned well in advance, that they get lots of warning, that you put in alternatives. And when you've got access to a train line, you do everything possible you can while you've got it. Maximize that very scarce resource. Okay, so those are all planning areas that you're already thinking about. But there's some other interesting outputs here. If we do a plan, say for the next 10 years, of all the work we need to do on the assets, that also tells us how many people we need. I'm a little bit tired of people having opinions about how many maintenance staff we need. It's not a matter of opinion. If this is the maintenance that we're going to do on our assets, we've decided the right planned and proactive maintenance, we know what kind of level of reactive maintenance we need to do, it should just a matter of working out how many people that requires. We've put a lot of squeeze on maintenance staff, thinking that we can keep cutting. But in the end, of course, you cut maintenance staff, you cut maintenance. And that is a very, very good example of an unsustainable practice. Cut the maintenance, you will increase your downtime immediately. Okay, so resources is going to, what we need for the next 10 years is going to be one of the outputs from this planning. I had a very interesting example here where, because I've been very involved in rail, I'm going to go back to a rail story where I don't know what it's like for you in Tacoma Power, but in rail, we never had enough signal engineers. Signal engineers is a very specific skill to railways, and there's never enough of them. We don't train enough of them in the world. And the problem we had was that we had committed to the government big expansion program of new train lines at the same time as replacement and renewal programs on traction supply, track, and on signals. so that we had a huge commitment to the government. They were giving us the money, that wasn't the issue, but we were committing that we were going to deliver all these things. And we just didn't have enough signal engineers. So my planning guys, I ran the asset management team, I had asset management planners, they looked at the next 10 years and all the things we'd committed to do and worked out by essentially, well, I've got this project needs signal engineers in this one, and if I kind of move them a bit so I don't need 17 one week and none the next, I optimize for the use of signal engineers, we were still short. We were short now, we were going to be even more short in 10 years with retirement. So we went to HR and we said to them, look, we've got this program, we can't deliver it unless we get more signal engineers. So if we don't deliver the government, it'll all be your fault. No, of course we didn't say that. We said, look, can we work with you to work out a strategy to get more signal engineers in place so we can actually deliver? And the really funny thing about it was they loved it. I don't know that anybody had ever had a conversation with HR where we kind of put down chapter and verse about why we needed what we needed and how important recruiting signal engineers and therefore how important HR was to meeting our commitments to the government, and that we offered to sit down and work out a strategy. Because the point was, if we went to them and said we need a signal engineer by next Tuesday, there's not much they can do. But if we said this is what we need to plan for the next 10 years, that allows them to come up with a strategy and to put it into practice. And to actually, that could be training, it could be stealing them from another country. As it happens, we decided that stealing them from Britain was a very good idea because for some reason lots of signal engineers in Britain thought that working on Bondi Beach would be good fun in Sydney. But the point was that we were allowing HR to do their job by allowing them to have strategies and plans. The same is true of budgets. Finance hates surprises. I mean, they hate it in a way which is, no, you can't have the money sort of way. They have ways of making their displeasure felt, but they love planning ahead because even if it's a problem, even if they can see we don't have money, if we warn them 10 years out, they can start thinking about what they can do about it. And the same thing is true of procurement. I don't know what your purchasing guys hate most, but in my experience, the thing that purchasing really hates most is when somebody goes to them and says, I needed this bit of equipment yesterday. I need it immediately, just now. And the reason that purchasing and procurement don't like that is because it goes against what they most want to do. They want to get good value for the organization through the purchases. And last minute purchases, emergency purchases, are just the most expensive way to buy any equipment or materials. Whereas if we give them a 10-year plan of what material and equipment we need, they can go to the market and negotiate long-term contracts with security of supply, bulk discounts. They can really do their job well because we could give them in advance what it is they needed to plan around. I hope that all makes sense. So the asset management plan isn't just talking about what maintenance people are going to do or capital project managers are going to do. It's also impacting on everybody else, on what HR needs to do or what procurement needs to do or what finance needs to do. In fact, the most difficult thing here of all is that in the end, we do plans already and we go to the government, we go to the city, we go for a rate case which says this is what we need to do for the next 5 years, give us the money or allow us the money on the rates. And on the whole, they go, well, at least show why you've decided you want to do these particular projects. Give us some reason, give us some data. But in the end, anybody giving us money, and that includes our executive, they don't want to know what projects we're going to deliver because that's not really what they're interested in. What they're really interested in is if we give you this money to do this capital program and this maintenance, what service are you going to deliver to the customers and how much is it going to cost us? So we have to move from here are the projects we're going to do to saying what these projects are actually going to deliver. Guess what? In terms of cost, risk and performance. And best practice in the world already does this. London Underground, for example, in their 10-year plans say, if we deliver this capital program, this is what's going to happen to on-time running. And this is what's going to happen to condition and reliability. But we have to understand our assets pretty well to be able to actually predict that if we do this work, this is the performance we're going to get. But that's where we have to end up. That's sooner or later, somebody's going to say, so what? So you've got these capital projects. What's that actually delivering to the customer? Okay, so asset management. No apologies for this being a cheesy slide. Asset management is definitely at the heart of everything we do at asset management. Okay, so just to finish off on planning, the one other problem, as well as not having integrated planning, different people having different plans that don't intersect with each other, we also have the problem that we tend to plan very short term. And when I say short term with assets, given how long our assets last, and we will have assets that could last 50 or even 100 years. Short term is 5 years. Not next week, but 5 years' time is really short term. And the problem with short term planning is you're not watching for those peaks coming forward of, I mean, I'll give you an example, wooden poles. So I've got a whole population of wooden poles, which are all about 75 years old. They all went in together, and I expect them to last about 85 years. But nobody's thinking about how we're going to start replacing wooden poles. And if I didn't ask the question, we might only realise that we've come to the end of the useful life of the wooden poles when they start falling over, which is too late, because by the time the poles start falling over, that means you've got customers out. So we need to plan ahead to see those, they're sometimes called bow waves. I've got a whole population of wooden poles that's getting nearer the day that it needs to replace. I can't replace them all at the same time. I don't have the money, I don't have the resources, and even if I did, I can't take all the lines out together. So I have to start planning for them now. If you only look short term, you don't see those bow waves, you don't see the problems that are coming in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Now, lots of people don't even plan 5 years, and their life must be full of unpleasant surprises, things happening that they, being smacked in the face with something. So the basic principle here is you can only do a good short-term plan in the context of a longer-term plan. Look longer out, you can see what's coming, and you can start planning for it now. Good examples of this are things like long lead time items, or even things like permits. I don't know how much of a problem you have with permits, but you need to get agreement from the community if you're going to do major work, build a new substation in the middle of it. Some of these things can take years to get, and you need to start planning for that now. It's no point in waiting until you actually want to replace something to realise it's going to take you 3 years to get the bits of equipment to do it. So you can only do good short-term planning if you have a longer-term perspective. Now, obviously, longer term is not specific. This is the wooden pole I want to replace on July 13th, 2033. We're not talking about that, but we know roughly what numbers of poles we need to be doing year on year to keep up with replacement and to keep kind of steady replacement going through. And as those projects get nearer to us in time, we can start to say, right, we're going to do this area, we're going to do this line, we want to replace these poles. So longer term, it's more outline, it's more rule-based, it's not specific assets, isn't the specific pole we're going to replace. And just as we get more short term, we can start to say specifically what we're going to do when. But the two of them have to go together. So we need long-term as well as short-term planning. Okay, so how are we doing so far?
Yeah, it's